Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a non-spoiler book review for The Art of the Prophecy by Wesley Chu. I'm going to break this review into formal categories. I'll have timestamps if you want to jump to any specific category, but each one's going to kind of bleed into the next, so I do have a specific order that I wanted to go in. And we're going to start with the plot, the general synopsis. We'll talk about the use of tropes in the story, including how the author sort of subverts your expectations with these tropes. That'll then lead us into the characters. A category after that I don't typically talk about, but I do have a few things to note about this, which would be the target demographic, the target audience. From there, though, we're going to talk about pacing and action scenes, and then at the very end, we'll talk about world building. Starting with the plot of the story, the setup definitely sounds like something you've heard before. It sounds a little generic. We follow this woman named Taisha and this prophesied hero named Xion. And Taisha very quickly at the beginning of the story is introduced to him, and she can see there's a lot of potential in him. There's a lot of skill that he has learned when it comes to fighting. The prophecy says that he will destroy this immortal Khan. And so when she meets him, she can see potential, but she's ultimately not impressed. She is somebody who has a lot of skill herself, and she basically stops the show and is like, hey, I'm going to take over from here, and I'm going to be his new master. And he is not a fan of that because he's accustomed to a certain lifestyle, he's accustomed to a certain way of people treating him, and he's very resistant to having this new mentor, but she's somebody who gets what she wants. And so she's like, no, the prophecy says that you are the person and you need to be prepared. So if you're not, that's a problem for everyone, and I'm going to fix this. So that's the setup for the story. You have the mentor figure, you have the prophesied hero, again, all things that you typically would expect in a fantasy story or things that we've seen many a time. But that's where the expectations sort of get flipped, because while we have seen a lot of these things before, they're not going to be what you expect. It's not really going to be a chosen one story. It's not really going to be, oh, look at this amazing mentor-mentee relationship. It will very quickly take you in a direction that you were not anticipating. There's more to the plot that I actually don't really want to get into because I do think that that is going to disrupt your reading experience. So even though it's kind of general and vague, that's all I'm going to say about the plot. But the way in which we subvert expectations, the tropes that are used, that is where I think this book is going to pull a lot of people in, and then it's going to shine. So as you can guess from that plot, there is a chosen one. There is this prophesied hero, and there's also a mentor figure. I pretty much never get tired of the mentor figure, and even if it is sort of your typical mentor figure, I don't care. I usually am like, you can just give me the same old with that trope, and I'll eat it up. But this one, it took it to the next level. It's done the mentor figure in a way that I now want the mentor figure to be at this level every single time. There's a few things that make Taisha different than a lot of other mentors. One is that she has a disability. And I was really excited to see a character that honestly can pretty much take on anybody in the story. Nobody really wants to mess with her. And she's somebody who has a disability. I feel like usually when you get the strongest of the strongest characters, or the characters that specialize in fighting, they have this superhuman strength, they're in incredible shape, they're super good looking, they're all the things. And this character is not that. She has this disability, but she's still a force to be reckoned with. You do not want to go up against her, you want her on your side. On top of that, she's an old woman. Throughout the story, people are constantly underestimating her because of her age, and it's not until they start to see her fight or they have to go up against her that they realize they've made a huge mistake in underestimating her. That was always so much fun. Anytime that somebody thought that they were going to have the upper hand, and then it turns out they don't, I was like, that's right. I was just always really pumped every time that she engaged in any scene. Any scene she was in was great. And on top of that, she's hilarious, and she's super grumpy, and she has no tolerance for anything. But under all of that is a lot of depth to this character. You do get kind of glimpses of what motivates them, of why they feel a little bit of a soft spot toward the prophesied hero, because he is unbearable, and he's been spoiled, and he's so frustrating. But just like with Taisha, Xian is a character that, while initially he is this sort of spoiled brat character, you can tell there's more to him also, and you see the way in which his environment has shaped him. And if his environment was different, and if he had the right people surrounding him, and he had the right kind of love, as opposed to just blind love, blind adoration, if you had people that actually cared about him and he wasn't so isolated and separated and treated so differently, you can see that there's potential in him. He's also very young. I think he acts appropriately young. How the two of them initially interact with each other and then where they go was, I thought, done really well. The arc for their relationship, not just the arcs for them individually, which were also great, but the arcs for the two of them and their relationship together, I thought was done so well. It was paced well. The growth of the characters was done really well. Another trope that I know a lot of you love, it's that I'm gonna fist bump the air like, yes, kind of a moment, is the here comes the cavalry. That is done in this book better than in most books. And sometimes I could feel it. I would be reading a page and I'm like, oh, this person's about to show up. And then they'd show up and I was like, yes. And it was just super exciting, and it was always, sometimes it was a little slow. It's been a while since anything's really been going on, and then all of a sudden everything would start to happen. Characters have been apart, and then you're like, oh, I know that they were headed this way. This person's gonna show up, and then as soon as somebody's about to meet their end, and then voila, someone else shows up and you're like, that's right. And it just was super exciting. So if you like that trope, if you like those moments where you're like, come on, this person's gonna be here, right? They're gonna be here, you will get that. It's done so well in this book. I did already start to talk about characters and talking about tropes. I'm going to formally jump into the character category now. So I've talked a lot about the main leads here. I've talked about Xian and Taisha quite a bit. The side characters that are introduced, you very quickly, as soon as a character will meet somebody, you can tell this person's going to be important. And something that I was really surprised to find is, with there being this prophesied hero, you kind of go into it thinking, okay, his responsibility is that someday he's going to take out this immortal Khan, this evil person who's conquering people all the time, or at least that's what you're led to believe. And then the author does a great job of showing you the other side, and then suddenly you're like, well, that's not as simple as it seemed at first. And so a lot of times when you get the chosen one, there's this feeling of they're the hero, they're the good guy, and then they're going to take out the ultimate evil. And what this author did was he showed you the other side, and you're like, they don't really seem bad though. And then so you're kind of questioning, do I even want this character to be this heroic figure? Is there even truth to this prophecy? And if there is, has it been warped? Because it feels like maybe things aren't as black and white as you first were led to believe. So while this kind of goes hand in hand with the tropes, I'd say that it's through the perspective of the other side that you get, and that's why I'm kind of putting it here in the character category. The opposition, the character who sort of represents the opposing force, will say, one, they were so fascinating to follow because you get little breadcrumbs of world building through them, and as you're getting it, you can't help but be intrigued, and you can't help but want to know more. The other two, you're like, I've seen this before. This is kind of classic fantasy, but maybe something a little different. And then you go over here and you're like, what's this? I want more of this. So every time I'd get that other character, I wanted to know more about the world through them, but then on top of that, I wanted to know more about them. They seemed more somber. They seemed more withheld. They seemed like they were somebody who had been through a lot, but why and how, you don't really know. And as you go through the story, you're getting a little bit more, and it constantly made me want to come back to that character. When you have a multiple perspective story, usually there's one character that stands out or a couple characters where you're like, ugh, when you go to someone else and you don't want to be with them. Every time we came back to this character, I was excited. The author also did a great job of, there are so many powerhouse characters in this. There are characters that are masters at what they do, and this other perspective is also amazing. But they all have their own distinct style of fighting. So every time you go to another character, you're like, oh, but they're also really powerful. And then you kind of can't help but be like, oh, when are they going to meet? Are they going to have to fight each other? What would that look like? And it made it sort of cinematic in a sense. It sort of made it feel like anytime you've been playing a video game or watching an anime where you're like, all right, there's these bad guys along the way, but you know, we're leading up to we're leading up to this. I don't know if we're going to get it in this book. I don't know if we're going to get it in future books, but this is going to happen at some point. These two are going to face off. And when they do, I don't really know whose side I'm going to be on. And I really liked that the author definitely made me care about every character, except for one who sort of throws a wrench in everything. It's not that I didn't enjoy reading about their perspective, but they are such a wild card character. There's basically a Harley Quinn in the story. There's a character that's a little different than anyone else, and one of the characters describes this other person as untethered, and I'm like, yeah, that's about right. Anytime that character showed up, you just knew it was adding a little bit of vibrance to the story and a little bit of extra flair. I've been praising the book quite a bit at this point. I'm going to jump into target audience, and I don't usually go into this because by talking about a book, I think a lot of times you can discern, oh, this is for me, or oh, that might not be for me. But I wanted to specifically highlight this because I think there's so much about this that can make it appealing to so many different people. And I wanted to also mention the ways in which I think we can put fantasy into boxes and how this book was like, nope, don't put me in a box. So I don't think there's anything wrong at all with there being a target audience for a book or a target age range. And I think where the problems end up is in how we treat books for certain target audiences. So for example, when you see something written for teenage girls, a lot of times people kind of roll their eyes at it, or teenage boys too. I mean, people just basically roll their eyes at things written for teenagers. And I can't stand that. I think it's important that there are books written for so many different groups of people. And with this book, it was interesting because it never felt like it was fitting into any one target audience. And sometimes when that happens, it means that a book feels like it doesn't know what it wants to be. But that wasn't the case with this one. It just feels like it can appeal to so many different people. So first off, it makes people a little uncomfortable, but I think it's kind of important to note what a lot of us think of when we think, quote, guy fantasy and, quote, girl fantasy. I remember asking on my Instagram stories, what leads you to believe, no judgment, but let's be realistic here. When you think girl fantasy versus guy fantasy, what do you think? For girl fantasy, you think female lead, you think sometimes written by a woman, you think there's going to be a heavy emphasis on romance, and then when it's for guys, you think, oh, lots of action, you're going to have a guy lead, a lot of times it's written by guys. And again, these are general concepts of what we think when we think target audience. This book had, I think, a fantastic mix of what you think when you think fantasy written for men and what you think when you think fantasy written for women. So it has a lot of action and really awesome action. I'll get into the action here in a little bit. So for that reason, you'd think it'd fall into this category. But then you get so many of the characters that are so cool and so awesome, and you're like, oh, this character, they're like a new favorite. They're all women and different ages of women. And I never really initially was thinking like, oh, cool, another strong female character who's like me or something like that. It wasn't that I liked them because they were women. It's just that it sort of shows you how women in fantasy, how a lot of us would like them to be written, which is that they're just all cool, interesting, layered, nuanced characters, and they happen to be women, which is great to see. And then you have the young boy character, and the reason that I like that we have this young boy character in the book is because I would say that while there's a lot of violence in this, I could see this being a story that it is adult fantasy for sure, but I could see young boys jumping into this and connecting to this character over here. And I think that's important because we see such a lack of books written for teenage boys. We just don't see that written very often. And I think that all the action, all the martial arts in the story, all the magic, which I haven't even gotten into, all that, plus having this prophesied hero that starts in a certain place who he feels kind of misunderstood, and as you get to know him more and he sort of, quote, levels up in the story, I just think that he's a character a lot of people might see themselves in, and I think that's important. But then you have all these awesome female characters and you're like, yay. It's just the characters are done so well, and the blending of what you would typically think for one target audience to the next, it was just done masterfully, and I think it's going to have a lot of appeal for both for both men and women. But then on top of that, there's also commentary on being mistreated in a society that thinks they have a certain perception of you, and they immediately will think less of you because of what you look like or because of where you're from. And I think that's another thing a lot of people can relate to. It wasn't necessarily just action-packed fantasy hero story. There's all these other aspects to it that I think a lot of other people can connect to in that way. But on top of all that, it's a blast. It's so fun, and there's a ton of humor throughout the story. It doesn't take itself too seriously, and at times it really does feel like you're watching an anime. Some of the dialogue and some of the moments, they're like borderline cheesy, but it sort of takes it so that, I don't take myself too seriously. I'm having fun, and now you're having fun alongside me. And so I think because of that, you have these heavier topics, and you have some of these other things going on with characters internally, but then you also have the fun aspect. And I know a lot of people, sort of what keeps certain books from being favorites for them is they're just too sad, or they're just too, everything feels so doom and gloom. And while I definitely like books like that, I think that sometimes you need the humor to sort of balance it out. What I will say though, is I think it's the third chapter, so pretty early in, almost went too cheesy and too ridiculous for me. I was like, I don't know about this book. And I'm like, I'm going to keep reading it though. We'll see. So I will say early on, if you're like, no, I don't think so, I would encourage you to keep pushing through. And some of the dialogue, again, is a little silly, but I didn't mind because I think that it was so well distributed throughout the story. I do think, though, that is the only thing that might keep some people, not the only thing, but that's one of the things that might keep you from loving it, is it's not really a serious book, and some people do not want to read the sillier side of stories. So if you're not somebody who wants that humor in your books, if you're somebody who wants to have it feel like it's really taking its time and really introspective and reflective, that's not this one. Getting, though, into the pacing and the action scenes. So I think that the beginning, the introduction to everything, it happens quick, but I always felt like I was able to keep up, and I was always interested in what was going to happen next. And then things get flipped on their head, things go in a direction you're not expecting, then you start getting introduced to newer things, and you're starting to see this more often, and then you're like, what's this over here? Like I was saying earlier about the other characters. And then by the time you know it, you're done with the book. I mean, I felt like I was always interested in what was going to happen. There are some moments of leveling up, I'll say, and for those of you who are big fans of Rage of Dragons, if you've read that book, or any book that has almost a montage dedicated to a character getting more advanced at a certain skill, what can happen sometimes is that you almost wish there were other characters to go to kind of break up the leveling up scenes, so that way when you come back to that character, you know, time has passed, okay, now they've developed this skill. Let's go to these other characters, learn about this, time has passed, oh, here's where they are now. That's what this book did, and that's my preference with those kinds of plot lines and stories. And so I never really felt like it was too slow, because even when something would be slow for one character, there was something else going on with another character that had me invested and wanting to learn more. There's also new enemies, we'll call them, introduced periodically throughout the story, and I think that's something a lot of people are going to think is really cool. So you have something called the Mute Men that you're introduced to early on, which are these very dedicated soldiers to the dukes and duchesses of this world. They've had their tongues cut out, so they can't ever betray them, and they are masters at what they do. And so you get introduced to them, and you're like, oh, I hope the characters don't end up having to deal with them right now, because they're definitely not in a position to fight them. Then later you get introduced to this really interesting assassin character that takes advantage of a certain kind of magic. And you're like, whoa, these people are intense. So there's always this, not only the characters are starting to get stronger, you're learning just how powerful some characters are, but then there's a new interesting enemy introduced, and you kind of can't help but be interested in what else is out there. And the action scenes were so good. The way that he combines the magic and the environment and the skills of the characters, the things you know are their weaknesses, the things you know are their strengths, versus these other characters over here and the things you know are their strengths and weaknesses, how everything is paired together. You can visualize it. and there's stakes involved in every scene. So I thought the action was phenomenal. And then last, the world building, which has to do with the setting itself and then also the magic. The magic is one of the things I don't feel like I quite know all that much about. I didn't mind because it wasn't always really relevant to the story necessarily. So when you are given information about magic, you're sort of given enough to know how it plays a role in what's happening currently. There is something inside people that has to do with their magic, and sort of trying to pull from that is definitely a big part of the story. It can influence how you fight and your fighting styles and your mastery over certain skills, which I thought was really cool. But I am excited to see more of that in other installments of the series. And then the setting. I was so interested anytime a character ended up in a new place. There's a setting in the book where a lot of the city is in these, I guess you can call them rings almost, that go underground, and there's these different levels, and the level that's closest to the surface is the wealthiest, and then as you get lower, there's more poverty. There's a place where it's like a moving desert, and they sort of ride these sand boats. I'm like, that's really cool. And then there's this place where entire cities are moving, and it's a really difficult place to navigate. There's some people that clearly navigate it better and live within it, and there's other people that they're like, do not go there. It's dangerous. You don't know what you're getting into. So all the places felt so well thought through and so interesting, and it makes me excited for the next books to see if our characters go to even newer places. I have basically nonstop praised this book. I do want to emphasize again that I think this book is probably not going to be for you if you're not a fan of the silly humor in stories, the sort of immature humor at times. If you don't want that, this is not the book for you. But otherwise, I just think so many of you would really, really love this book. I can't wait to jump into sequels. I think this series has potential to be a new favorite. I had so much fun with it. I feel like it needs an adaptation. I already can visualize everything, and I want somebody to make it come to life in a visual medium. I just really enjoyed it. I had such a great time, and it's going under people's radars, and that makes me sad because it was really good, and I know so many of you would really like it. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I'll have a link to it if you're interested in giving it a try. I hope you have a great rest of your day, though, and I'll see you all later. Bye.